Number 1. Ronald Lee Haskell. There are crimes that shock us because of how random they are. Then there are crimes that horrify us for the exact opposite reason. Because they were so deliberate, so calculated, and so deeply personal that the cold-blooded nature of it refuses to leave the imagination. Ronald Lee Haskell belongs to that second, darker category. His crime was not a sudden eruption. It was a plan, rehearsed, refined, and executed with chilling precision against a family whose only offense was loving someone he felt he had lost. Ronald was born on August 26, 1980, and grew up moving between Eagle River, Alaska, and parts of California. He attended Chugiak High School in Alaska, where classmates knew him as the class clown. He was voted prom king and homecoming king. By outward appearances, he was the kind of young man people liked being around. He had social energy, a big personality, and the ability to charm a room. It is one of the many unsettling details of this story that the person who would later walk into a family home and destroy 6 lives was once celebrated for his ability to make people smile. Charm, it turns out, is not the same thing as character. Ronald married a woman named Melanie Lyon in 2002. The couple were part of a tight-knit Mormon community in Southern California. They had children together. For years, they appeared to be a functioning family. But beneath the surface of that ordinary life, Ronald was struggling. Family members described a man haunted by anger and depression. He was treated by multiple doctors over the years for emotional instability. His marriage did not survive these pressures. On Valentine's Day of 2014, a date that carries its own grim irony, the divorce was finalized. Melanie moved to Houston, Texas, assisted by her sister Katie Stay and Katie's family. That act of support, an act of pure love from one family member to another, placed the Stays directly in Ronald's line of sight. What happened next tells you everything about the kind of man Ronald had become. In the weeks following the divorce, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He fixated not just on Melanie, but on everyone he believed had helped her leave him. He could not accept that the marriage was over. He could not accept that the people around his ex-wife had simply tried to help her be safe. In his mind, helping Melanie was an act of war. The Stay family was at the top of that mental list. On July 2, 2014, just 1 week before the murders, he confronted his own mother, Carla, after she admitted she had been in contact with his ex-wife. He tied her up with duct tape and threatened to harm members of his own family unless she gave him information. Carla sought a restraining order against her own son. It was a desperate plea for protection that the legal system registered, but could not act on fast enough. Ronald traveled from California to Texas. He did not go to reconcile. He did not go to grieve. He drove across state lines with a weapon, a disguise, and a purpose that no amount of mental health history could fully explain away. He went to collect what he believed was a debt owed to him by people who had simply chosen to love his ex-wife more than they feared him. On the morning of July 9, 2014, Ronald arrived at the Stay family home in Spring, Texas. He was wearing a FedEx uniform. He had driven a vehicle designed to resemble a delivery truck. He had thought this through. He knocked on the door with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times in his mind. When the door opened, he presented himself as something harmless, something expected, something that belonged at a suburban front door on a Wednesday morning. The deception was complete. He gained entry into the home of a family that had done nothing wrong except love someone he had lost. What unfolded inside that home in the hours that followed is the part of this story that defies easy description. Ronald forced the entire family into the living room. Stephen Stay, 39 years old, husband and father, was there. Katie Stay, 33, Melanie's sister, was there. Their 5 children were there. Brian, 13, Emmeline, Rebecca, 7, Zachary, just 4 years old, and 15-year-old Cassidy. Ronald bound them. He demanded to know where Melanie was. The family, by all accounts, did not know. They could not give him what he wanted because they did not have it. That did not stop him. Think about what it means to be Stephen Stay in that room. A grown man, bound and helpless, watching his children in the same situation, unable to do the one thing every father in the world is wired to do, which is protect them. Think about what it means to be Brian, 13 years old enough to understand completely what is happening, and young enough to be entirely powerless against it. Ronald moved through that room with a 9mm Springfield Armory semi-automatic pistol, and he shot every person in it. He shot Stephen, he shot Katie, he shot Brian, Emily, Rebecca, and 4-year-old Zachary. He did this methodically, in what investigators described as an execution-style approach, deliberate, sequential, leaving no one unaccounted for. Cassidy was also shot in the head. And here is where the story pivots in a direction Ronald did not plan for. Cassidy did not die. She lay still in the blood of her family and she waited. She felt the bullet, she felt the chaos, and she made a conscious decision to remain motionless until she was certain he had left. When Ronald walked out of that house, intending to drive to another relative's home and continue, Cassidy crawled to a phone and called 911. Her voice on that recording is almost impossible to listen to, and simultaneously one of the most extraordinary things in the history of Texas criminal justice. She was 15. She had just lost 5 members of her immediate family in the span of a single morning. She was physically injured in a way that would have incapacitated most adults. And she was coherent enough to tell the dispatcher her Uncle Ronald's full name, describe his vehicle, and warn police that he was on his way to harm her grandparents next. Because of Cassidy's stay, her grandparents survived. Police moved quickly. They established a perimeter and located Ronald still in the area. After a standoff that lasted several hours, he surrendered peacefully around 10 o'clock that evening. The evidence was overwhelming. The disguise, the weapon, the ballistics, the stolen credit cards and personal items, the jailhouse records of his mother's restraining order, and the testimony of the sole survivor, who had heard every shot and played dead through all of it. At trial in 2019, Ronald's defense argued schizophrenia, that he had heard voices, that his mind had been broken by illness, and that his actions were the product of a fractured reality, rather than a planned vendetta. Prosecutors answered with the timeline itself. The FedEx uniform had to be purchased. The vehicle had to be chosen. The drive from California to Texas had to be made. The rope and the weapon had to be brought to that door. None of those things happen because of a hallucination. They happen because of a decision. The jury agreed without much deliberation. They convicted him on 6 counts of capital murder and sentenced him to death by lethal injection on October 11, 2019. As of 2026, Ronald Lee Haskell remains on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky unit in Texas in his mid-40s, pursuing appeals and contesting legal motions, including a controversy over a judge's alleged bias in his case. His legal fight continues. But for the community of Spring, Texas, and for Cassidy, who stood in that courtroom as a young adult and testified against the man who wore a FedEx uniform to her front door, the debate is secondary to a truth that no appeal can change. 6 people went to their living room on a Wednesday morning and never came back. And the person responsible sits in a cell in Texas, still alive, while a girl who once lay in her family's blood grew up carrying a grief that no sentencing phase can fully address. The most enduring image of this case is not Ronald, it is Cassidy. It is the teenager who survived not by luck alone, but by extraordinary presence of mind. It is the young woman who stood in court, faced the man who tried to erase her entire family from the earth, and told her story with her head high. She became the reason justice was even possible. She became the voice for 5 people who no longer had one. Some people look at a tragedy and find only darkness. Cassidy looked at the same darkness and chose, in every breath that followed, to become a light. Number 2. Bartholomew Granger. Most people, when they receive devastating news in a courtroom, go silent. They absorb it, they grieve it, they lean into the people beside them. The courtroom, for all its severity, is still supposed to be a civilized space, a place where conflict is resolved through law, not through force. Bartholomew Granger decided that the law was not good enough. He decided to bring something else entirely. And in doing so, he ensured that a woman who had no part in his story would never walk out of a courthouse alive again. Bartholomew was born on September 26, 1970, in Galveston County, Texas. Public records offer little detail about his early years. He completed only the 8th grade. He went on to work as a truck driver, building a blue-collar life in southeast Texas. He had family in the area, including brothers and a mother, Valerio Zine, and father, Ulysses Granger Sr., who would later plead for his life in a courtroom. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about Bartholomew Granger. No lengthy criminal history. No documented trail of escalating violence. He was, by most accounts, an unremarkable man living an ordinary life. But ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary dysfunction. And in the Granger household, the dysfunction ran deep enough to produce criminal charges that would end with Bartholomew sitting at a defendant's table facing capital murder. That ordinary life began to unravel when his daughter Samantha Jackson made allegations of childhood sexual assault against him. She also made similar accusations against his brother Lyndon. By early 2012, Bartholomew was facing trial for aggravated sexual assault of a child, his own daughter, who was 20 years old at the time of the proceedings, but was describing harm allegedly done to her years before. Think about what it took for Samantha to sit in that witness chair. She was not a stranger testifying about a stranger. She was a daughter testifying about her father. She had to look at the man who raised her, who sat at her table, who was in her life from the very beginning, and say things no daughter should ever have to say in a court of law. Samantha testified the day before the shooting. She stood before the court and told her truth. That act of courage placed her in Bartholomew's crosshairs. On the morning of March 14, 2012, Bartholomew drove from Houston to Beaumont. He had a .40 caliber rifle in his truck. That is not the kind of thing you forget to bring. That is not the kind of thing that ends up in your vehicle by accident. He told his brother that morning that his head was, in his own words, completely messed up. That was either an honest self-assessment or the last warning no one acted on. When he arrived at the Jefferson County Courthouse, he sat with that rifle for a while. He knew where Samantha and Claudia, her mother and his former partner, would be. He knew the layout. He had been in and out of that courthouse throughout the trial. He parked, he waited, and then, around 11 o'clock in the morning, he retrieved the rifle and walked toward his family. He opened fire in front of the building. Samantha was shot. Claudia was shot. Both survived. Though Samantha's survival was not without its own subsequent horror, which we will come to in a moment. In the chaos of the shooting, a 79-year-old woman named Minnie Ray Sebolt was also struck by gunfire. Minnie was not connected to Bartholomew. She was not connected to the trial. She was at the Jefferson County Courthouse that day because she was trying to help a friend file paperwork for veterans' benefits. An act of generosity, a completely unremarkable act of friendship between elderly women that placed her in the path of a man she had never met. She died near the courthouse entrance. Her daughter, Deborah Ray Holst, described losing her mother as the shattering of something that cannot be repaired. Minnie was, in the words of her family, a ray of sunshine. She was buried without ever having understood why her day at the courthouse ended the way it did. After the shooting, Bartholomew did not stop. He climbed back into his truck and, in a moment so extreme it stopped investigators in their tracks when they first heard it, drove the vehicle over his own daughter, who was already lying injured on the ground. He then fled. Police pursued him immediately. Officers disabled his truck during the chase, forcing him to abandon the vehicle and take refuge in a nearby commercial building, the Richard Construction Inc. facility, where he took employees hostage at gunpoint. He was wounded by this point. The situation was unstable and tense. But remarkably, some of the hostages inside that building managed to physically overpower him and disarm him before police forced entry. He was taken into custody that same afternoon, having devastated 2 families and ended 1 life in the span of a single morning. What happened in the courtroom during his trial in 2013 moved to Galveston County because of the intense media saturation in southeast Texas, added a new layer of documented cruelty to the record. Bartholomew did not sit quietly and allow the process to unfold. He shouted profane remarks about his daughter as she testified. He held up a notepad and turned it toward the jury so they could read the single word he had written on it: death. When family members of Minnie Sebolt delivered victim impact statements, when Minnie's daughter stood before the court to describe what it meant to lose her mother, Bartholomew interrupted. He spoke over her grief. He had to be physically restrained, gagged, and shackled in the courtroom, a measure so extreme that most judges will go years without ever having to order it. It is reserved for defendants who are not merely disruptive, but who are actively committed to preventing the court from functioning. Bartholomew earned it on multiple occasions during the same trial. The jury convicted him on April 30th, 2013. They sentenced him to death on May 7th of that same year. His parents stood before the court during the sentencing phase and described their son with love and grief, asking the jury to spare his life. It was an agonizing moment for his family. But the jury carried Minnie Sebolt's face into that deliberation room alongside the Granger family's testimony, and they could not separate the two. They returned a verdict that reflected what the evidence demanded. As of 2026, Bartholomew Granger remains on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. He is in his mid-50s. The United States Supreme Court rejected his most recent certiorari petition in 2025. His legal options are effectively exhausted. No execution date has been formally scheduled, but he is running out of road. His story does not contain a chapter of reflection or remorse. It contains a daughter who chose courage, a courthouse that was supposed to be safe, and a 79-year-old woman who went out that morning to help a friend and never came home. And the man who pulled the trigger sits in a cell in Texas, still alive, still fighting, still occupying space in the world that Minnie Sebolt was supposed to fill. Number 3. Ricky Donnell Cummings. Some stories are about guilt that is obvious and immediate. Others sit in a more complicated space. A space where the conviction is real, the sentence is handed down, and yet the questions that trail behind it refuse to go away. Ricky Donnell Cummings occupies that second space. And the tension between what the courts decided and what supporters claim makes his story one of the most debated capital cases in recent Texas history. Ricky was born on August 23, 1989, in McLennan County, Texas. He grew up in Waco, in the neighborhoods of East Waco that have long been defined by cycles of poverty, conflict, and street-level loyalty. He was not a hardened criminal by official record. He had completed the 12th grade. He worked as a warehouse laborer before his arrest. He had no prior prison record. By the standard markers used to predict violent behavior, Ricky did not fit the profile. But the people who knew him understood that profile is not the whole story. The community he came from ran on a different set of rules. Rules built around loyalty, retaliation, and an unspoken code that said certain wrongs could not go unanswered. In April of 2010, a young man named Emuel Bowers III, known in the neighborhood as Man, was murdered. Ricky described Emuel as being like a brother to him. That loss did not sit quietly inside him. It festered, it built, and according to prosecutors, it eventually pointed him toward the men he believed were connected to Emuel's death. One of those men was a young man named Keenan Hubert. In the months between that April of 2010 and the spring of 2011, tensions in East Waco between these circles escalated. There were confrontations, there were rumors. There was even a reported incident in which Keenan allegedly rapped antagonizing lyrics toward Ricky. These are the kinds of details that sound minor from the outside but carry enormous weight in the social economy of the neighborhoods where they occurred. To the people living inside those dynamics, these were not small provocations. They were declarations. On March 28, 2011, a car sat parked at the Lakewood Villas apartment complex in Waco, the same complex where Ricky's grandmother lived, a place he knew well and visited often. Inside the vehicle were 4 young men, Keenan Hubert, Tyre Sneed, DeAndre Majors, and Marion Bible. They were sitting together the way young men do, talking, existing, expecting nothing more from that afternoon than the afternoon itself. What happened next took less time than it takes to describe. More than 20 shots were fired into that car from multiple directions. The gunfire was overwhelming. Investigators would later recover shell casings consistent with weapons of different calibers, indicating more than one shooter. Keenan, 20 years old, was struck multiple times and died at the scene. Tyus, who was only 17 years old, also died. DeAndre and Marion were struck but managed to get out of the vehicle and flee. According to one witness, a man with a jammed pistol pursued the survivors on foot after the initial burst of gunfire. The chase failed. The gun did not cooperate. That mechanical failure may be the only reason 2 people walked away from Lakewood Villas alive. Think about what was lost in those moments. Keenan Hubert was 20 years old with an infant child who was under 1 year old at the time of his death. That baby grew up without a father because of something that happened in a parking lot before he was old enough to remember anything. Tyre Sneed was 17. 17. He had not even finished becoming who he was going to be. The victim impact statements delivered at sentencing put language around grief that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Fathers described not being able to sleep. Mothers described hearing sounds in their nightmares that they could not silence. Marion Bible, who survived the attack, stood in court and told Ricky directly that his life had been permanently altered, that he lived with paranoia and fear that had not faded with time. These were not dramatic performances for the court. This was the honest accounting of what it costs to survive something like Lakewood Villas. Ricky was arrested on April 1, 2011, just 4 days after the shooting. He maintained from the beginning that he was not there. He said he had been selling marijuana nearby and was picked up by family shortly before the shooting began. The investigation built a different picture. A .45 caliber pistol connected to Ricky was recovered from his brother Darvis's car. A witness named Nicole Henry told investigators she had observed Ricky after the shooting with what appeared to be a jammed pistol, consistent with the witness account of a man chasing survivors whose weapon had failed. Another witness, Michael Atkins, reported hearing statements from Ricky that investigators found incriminating. Cell phone data placed his device in proximity to the scene. His brother Darvis was charged as a co-defendant. Another man, Albert Love, was also charged, his connection to the case running through his own grief over the death of Emuel Bowers. The 2012 trial in McLennan County did not take long from the jury's perspective. Prosecutors assembled a web of circumstantial evidence: the weapon, the witnesses, the gang associations that prosecutors argued motivated the retaliation, and the established emotional link between Ricky and the murdered Emuel Bowers. The defense challenged every thread. They pointed to a witness with a documented mental health history. They noted that no ballistics directly matched the recovered gun to specific victims. They argued that tattoos and neighborhood associations had been translated into criminality in a way that was unfair and racially loaded. The jury deliberated for approximately 3 hours. They returned a guilty verdict. The punishment phase followed, and on November 13, 2012, Ricky Donnell Cummings was sentenced to death. He was 23 years old. In the years since that verdict, the case has grown more complicated rather than less. His co-defendant Albert Love was also convicted, but Love's conviction was later overturned on appeal because prosecutors had presented text messages that were ultimately determined to belong to someone else. That evidentiary error has cast a long shadow over Ricky's case as well, since similar messaging evidence was presented against him. Supporters launched a public campaign called I Am Ricky Cummings, arguing that he was wrongfully condemned by thin circumstantial evidence, systemic bias, and community pressure to assign accountability for a tragedy that left 2 young men dead. Federal habeas petitions have been filed and denied. Prosecutors and victims' families see it differently. They see a young man who had every reason to want Keenan dead, who was linked to the scene by multiple witnesses and physical evidence, and whose conviction has been upheld on direct appeal through the Texas court system. They see 2 families who buried their sons and who deserve justice. Both perspectives exist simultaneously. That is what makes this case one of the most genuinely difficult on this list, not because the facts are unclear, but because the honest answer to the question of what happened in that parking lot remains disputed by people with every reason to know. As of 2026, Ricky remains on death row at the Polunsky unit with no execution date set. His legal challenges continue, and Keenan's child is growing up somewhere in Waco, old enough now to ask questions that no verdict fully answers. Number 4. Stephen LaWayne Nelson. There are people who enter the world disadvantaged and still choose a different path. And then there are people who enter the world disadvantaged, receive intervention after intervention, and still choose destruction. Stephen LaWayne Nelson is a case study in the second category, a man whose life became a long argument about whether the system failed him or whether he was simply beyond what any system could reach. The answer, when you sit with all the evidence, is more uncomfortable than either side of that debate is willing to admit. Stephen was born on February 18, 1987, in Ada, Oklahoma. His childhood was not a foundation. It was a wound. He grew up in a home defined by instability, neglect, and violence from adults who were supposed to protect him. His mother frequently left her children unattended for extended periods, days at a time, with no arrangement made for their care or safety. His father was largely absent and abusive when he was present. Signs of deep distress appeared when Stephen was barely old enough to walk. At age 3, he reportedly attempted to set fire to his mother's bed. Criminologists and psychologists who study early childhood behavior will tell you that fire setting at that age is one of the clearest possible distress signals a young child can produce. It is a child whose internal world is already on fire, trying to make the external world match. Nobody addressed it adequately. By age 6, Stephen had already had contact with juvenile authorities in Oklahoma for property crimes. By 13, he was arrested for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. He was committed to the Texas Youth Commission at 14 for a cluster of offenses and served over 3 years in that system, accumulating infractions even while incarcerated. Every intervention failed. Every door opened by the system was pushed shut by Stephen himself. Or perhaps neither of those things fully captures what happened. Perhaps the doors were too flimsy and opened too late for a child already shaped by years of damage. By adulthood, the trajectory was locked in. He cycled in and out of state jail for theft and burglary. He was placed on probation for aggravated assault against a live-in girlfriend, a charge his partner later tried to withdraw, likely out of fear. In early 2011, Stephen was on probation and actively avoiding his probation officer's check-ins. He had no stable income. He had no stable housing. His behavioral pattern had not changed in 20 years. And on the morning of March 3, 2011, all of that history, the neglect, the rage, the years of uncorrected trajectory, converged on a single location, a church in Arlington, Texas. North Point Baptist Church was a place of quiet community purpose. The church secretary, Judy Elliott, was 69 years old and had spent years serving her congregation with devotion. The pastor, Clint Dobson, was 28, a young man with his entire ministry ahead of him, known by those who loved him for his warmth and his commitment to the people in his care. On that morning, both were at the church doing what they did every day, working, serving, expecting nothing more unusual from the morning than the morning itself. Stephen arrived with 2 associates. Their stated intention was robbery. What they actually brought into that building was something far worse than that. When they encountered Clint and Judy inside, the encounter escalated with devastating speed. Clint fought. The physical evidence told that story clearly. Injuries to his head, his face, his back, his shoulders, his arms, and his hands all indicated a man who did not submit, who struggled, who tried to resist. He was beaten and then bound with a computer extension cord. He lost his life inside the walls of the church where he had chosen to serve his community. He was 28 years old. He had a wife. He had people who filled a memorial service to capacity. More than 200 people who came to honor someone whose future had been taken from him in a place of worship. Judy was also severely assaulted, struck with a force that caused head trauma and internal bleeding so severe that when her husband John first reached the hospital and saw her face, he did not recognize the woman he had spent his life with. She required metal implants. She required months of rehabilitation and therapy. She survived, but the woman who walked out of that hospital was carrying physical damage she would live with for the rest of her life. She passed away in 2024, years later, having never fully recovered from that morning. What did Stephen and his associates take from North Point Baptist Church? Clint's laptop, which Stephen sold. Clint's cell phone. Judy's credit cards, which Stephen used to make purchases. Judy's car, which Stephen drove. He traded a man's life and a woman's health for items worth a few $100s at most. And then he went shopping. Investigators connected Stephen within 48 hours. He had failed to report to his probation officer the day of the attack, a detail that immediately flagged him. His fingerprints were found at the scene. Biological matter from the victims was recovered from his shoes. A fragment of his belt was found inside the church. The stolen card transactions created a digital trail. He was arrested 2 days after the crime. At his own trial in Tarrant County in October of 2012, He chose to take the witness stand against the advice of his attorneys. He acknowledged being at the church. He admitted participating in the robbery. He claimed he was only a lookout. He pointed to two other men, one of whom was never indicted, as the actual perpetrators of the physical harm. The jury heard all of it. They rejected it entirely. They also heard about an incident during the pre-trial period at the Tarrant County Jail, in which Stephen allegedly used a blanket to harm a mentally ill fellow inmate named Jonathan Holden. The charges in that incident were eventually dropped, but the evidence of the act itself was placed before the jury as a window into what Stephen was capable of even while incarcerated and awaiting trial. The jury sentenced him to death on October 16, 2012. His appeals raised questions about the law of parties, about his childhood abuse as a mitigating factor, and about the reliability of some evidence, but they were denied at every level, including by the United States Supreme Court. Stephen Lewayne Nelson was executed by lethal injection on February 5, 2025, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 37 years old. His spiritual advisor reported that Stephen expressed some measure of regret in his final statement. Judy's son attended the execution on her behalf. She had died the year before, in 2024, without seeing the conclusion of the legal case that had defined so much of her later years. The family said they had found a way to forgive. Clint's congregation remembered him the way they always had, as someone genuinely good who was taken from a world that needed more people like him. Stephen's execution was the first carried out by Texas in 2025. It closed a file that had been open for 24 years of accumulated failures. His, the systems, and the adults who were supposed to raise him, but did not. Number 5. David Ray Conley. There is a specific kind of terror that comes not from a stranger, but from someone who was once trusted, someone who knew the layout of a home, knew the names of the children inside it, and used that intimacy not to protect but to destroy. David Ray Conley III represents that terror in its most extreme form. He did not stumble into that house on Falling Oaks Road. He knew exactly where the windows were. He knew which rooms the children slept in. He knew those faces. And that knowledge, in his hands, became the most dangerous thing in Harris County. On August 8, 2015. David was born on December 29, 1966. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already accumulated a long and troubling history of criminal behavior and domestic violence dating back to at least 1988. His romantic relationships followed a consistent and alarming pattern. He was controlling. He was volatile. He used physical intimidation as a tool of dominance in every household he entered. His relationship with a woman named Valerie Jackson was on and off for years and produced a son, Nathaniel. Eventually, Valerie moved forward with her life. She married Dwayne Jackson Sr. Together they built a household with 6 children. Dwayne Jr., Honesty, Caleb, Trinity, Jonah, and Nathaniel. She changed the locks on the door, a small, ordinary act of finality that communicated something simple and essential. You do not live here anymore. In David's mind, that message landed as an act of war. In the days leading up to August 8th, David had allegedly assaulted Valerie by slamming her head against a refrigerator. That assault case was still active in the courts. Child Protective Services had been involved with the household before. In 2013, the children had been temporarily removed due to abuse allegations involving both David and Dwayne Sr., and later returned. The family's history with the system was layered and complex. What is not complex is what David did in the days immediately before the murders. He purchased a 9mm pistol. He purchased ammunition. He purchased handcuffs. Courts later identified these purchases as evidence of deliberate planning. A person buying handcuffs days after assaulting his ex-girlfriend and days before entering her home through a window is not making an impulse purchase. On the morning of August 8, 2015, David arrived at the home on Falling Oaks Road at approximately 10:30 in the morning. Because Valerie had changed the locks, he entered through a window that had been left unlocked. He moved through the house. He found Valerie, Dwayne Sr., and the 6 children. He herded them into the master bedroom. Some of the victims were handcuffed. Some were restrained by other means. And then, inside that room, with the family confined and helpless, David Conley began the most methodical and horrifying act of familial violence in Harris County history. He shot Dwayne Sr. first, then the children, one by one. Nathaniel, who was 13, his own son, a boy who shared his blood. Honesty, 11. Dwayne Jr., 10. Canine. Trinity, 7. Jonah, 6 years old. He moved through that room as if completing a task. And Valerie was kept alive through all of it. She was forced to be present, to watch, to bear witness to every single moment of what David was doing to the people she had spent her life protecting and loving. She was the last person in that room to die. That specific sequence, saving her for last, requiring her to see everything before she was released from it, tells you more about David Conley than any psychological profile ever could. In total, he discharged his firearm at least 34 times. He was still inside that house hours after it began. Throughout the day, Harris County deputies conducted 4 separate welfare checks on the property. Valerie's mother had received a text message from her daughter early in the morning indicating she was in danger. Officers knocked. They walked the perimeter. They received no response and did not force entry. It was not until the 4th check, around 6 o'clock in the evening, that a body was spotted through a window. Officers forced their way inside around 8 o'clock. David opened fire on them immediately. They retreated. Backup was called. Negotiations began. At approximately 9 o'clock that night, roughly 10.5 hours after he entered through that window, David Conley surrendered. He was arrested and taken into custody. Hours later, he called Valerie's brother on the phone and confessed. He sat down with community activist Quanell X in the jail and told the full story. That conversation reportedly ended with Quanell walking out of the room, unable to continue. In a jailhouse interview, David said he had been fed up. He recanted his earlier confession in stages, but the physical and forensic evidence required no confession to make the case. His trial took place in 2021. Prosecutors determined at the outset that they would not seek the death penalty because both state and defense experts agreed that David had a genuine intellectual disability, a legal finding that made him constitutionally ineligible for execution under United States Supreme Court precedent. On October 7, 2021, he was convicted of capital murder. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He is currently housed at the W.J. Estelle unit in Texas. The case generated a sustained public debate about the police response, specifically about whether earlier and more forceful action during those 4 welfare checks might have shortened the timeline and saved some of the lives lost inside that bedroom. It is a question the community of Harris County has not entirely let go. The names spoken aloud at sentencing, Nathaniel, Honesty, Dwayne Jr., Caleb, Trinity, and Jonah, ranged in age from 6 to 13. The oldest was barely a teenager. The youngest had barely learned to read. Behind each name was a voice David silenced in a room that should have been the safest place in their world. Number 6. Larry Jean Ashbrook. There are people who carry their pain quietly for decades, building invisible walls around themselves until the walls become a prison. And there are rare, disturbing cases in which that internal prison eventually becomes unbearable, and the person inside it decides, in the most catastrophic way possible, to break out. Larry Jean Ashbrook is one of those cases, and what makes his story particularly agonizing is the specific cruelty of his target. Not a government building, not a public institution, but a room full of teenagers gathered to express their faith. He chose the most innocent possible audience for the worst possible act. Larry was born on July 10, 1952. He spent the better part of his adult life in Fort Worth, Texas, living in the same house where he had grown up. His mother passed away in 1990, and the neighbors who watched his life from across the fence said that her death marked the point where Larry stopped simply being odd and started becoming something they actively feared. He had always been unusual, prone to angry outbursts, unable to hold a job, increasingly detached from the rhythms of ordinary social life. After she died, the unusual curdled into something worse. He had served briefly in the United States Navy as a sonar operator, but holding employment consistently was something Larry simply could not manage. His one minor criminal record came from 1971 for marijuana possession. Nothing in that history that would cause a law enforcement database to flag him as dangerous. He lived alone in the family home. He became more reclusive with every year. Neighbors watched him treat his elderly father, Jack, with a visible roughness that was distressing to observe. He took the old man's car without permission. He pushed him. He spoke to him harshly. And when Jack Ashbrook passed away on July 20th, 1999, about 8 weeks before the church shooting, whatever fragile connection Larry maintained to the world of ordinary human relationships was effectively severed. He had no one left who remembered him as anything other than what he had become. In the months before September of 1999, Larry was writing letters to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. He visited newspaper offices in person, demanding that reporters listen to him, insisting that the CIA was conducting a psychological warfare campaign against him specifically, that he was being framed for crimes he did not commit, and that no one was taking his warnings seriously. He was right about the last part, and tragically wrong about all the rest. Investigators who later searched his home found holes punched through walls, plumbing fixtures deliberately destroyed, fruit trees in the backyard that had been poisoned, a Bible that had been mutilated. The house was not just a home. It had become the exterior documentation of an interior catastrophe. Every damaged wall a record of something that had gone wrong inside the man who lived there. He had legally purchased 2 handguns in February of 1999. He had collected materials capable of being fashioned into explosive devices. None of these acquisitions triggered any intervention because none of them were illegal. The system had no mechanism for what Larry Ashbrook was becoming. On the evening of September 15th, 1999, he drove to Wedgwood Baptist Church in Fort Worth. A See You at the Pole youth rally was underway, an annual event where Christian students gather for prayer and music. That night, the Christian rock band 40 Days was performing. The sanctuary held somewhere between 150 and 200 people, the majority of them teenagers. Larry arrived wearing mirrored sunglasses and smoking a cigarette. A church employee approached him about the cigarette inside the building. That interaction lasted seconds. Larry immediately produced a firearm. He moved into the sanctuary. Many of the young people who saw him enter initially believed they were watching a skit. Something staged, something theatrical, something that belonged to the performance they had come to see. The confusion lasted only a breath before the reality became unmistakable. He began shouting anti-religious statements and opened fire with both handguns, the 9mm Ruger and the .380 caliber AMT backup, into the crowd of teenagers and adults. He fired as people scattered, as they dove beneath pews, as they ran for exits that may or may not have been clear. He reloaded. 3 times investigators recovered empty magazines. He threw a pipe bomb that detonated with force and noise, but did not cause fatalities, its trajectory sending the blast upward rather than outward. 7 people died. Christy Beckel, 14 years old. 14. Cassandra Griffin, 14. Justin Ray, 17. Sidney Browning, 36. Sean Brown, 23. Susan Jones, 23. 7 others were wounded. In the middle of the attack, a young man named Jeremy Neitz walked toward Larry, not away from him, but toward him, and told him directly that he did not have to continue, that there was still a way out, that his life still had value. Larry mocked him. He answered Jeremy's gesture of courage with contempt. Eventually he moved to a back pew. He sat down. He placed one of the handguns to his own head and ended his life as the first officers were arriving outside. The entire attack had taken fewer than 10 minutes. There was no trial. There was no arrest. There was only the aftermath. The families of 7 dead teenagers and adults, the community of Fort Worth trying to process a horror that unfolded in under 10 minutes, and a church congregation that chose, in the weeks that followed, to respond with forgiveness rather than fury. President Bill Clinton addressed the nation. Texas Governor George W. Bush offered condolences. Investigators searched Larry's home thoroughly. They found the journals, the paranoid writings, the bomb-making materials, the evidence of systematic destruction. They found no organizational affiliation. No group claimed him. He had not been recruited or radicalized by any movement with a name. He was, in the end, a deeply isolated man consumed by delusions and an old, bitter resentment toward a religion that had marked his childhood in ways he never resolved. He died having never explained himself clearly, leaving behind 7 families permanently altered by a man who chose the most defenseless audience he could find, and turned their evening of faith into something none of them would ever recover from fully. Number 7. Herbie Lee Bowser. The world has a way of projecting goodness onto people who perform it publicly. A man who teaches children with disabilities is assumed to be patient, empathetic, and gentle at his core. A man who dances professionally, who serves his country in uniform, who starts a non-profit for young people. That man is assumed to carry those same qualities into every room he enters. Herbie Lee Bowser was all of those things, in the most visible and celebrated sense. He was also something else entirely. And on the night of August 7th, 2013, the distance between those two versions of him collapsed with a finality that 4 women and their children paid for with everything they had. Herbie was born in 1964. For the majority of his adult life, he wore his public identity like a well-fitted suit. He was a special education teacher in the Dallas area. He was a United States military veteran. He was a founding member of the Dallas Mavericks all-male dance troupe, the Manny ASEs, a role that placed him in arenas in front of cameras and gave him a kind of community visibility most people never achieve. He also founded a non-profit organization aimed at helping young people. On the surface, Herbie Bowser was someone worth celebrating. His private life told a different story. By the summer of 2013, he was estranged from his wife, Zena Bowser. He was living with a girlfriend, Toya Smith, in southwest Dallas. The relationships in his personal life were defined by a pattern that those close to him described as volatile and cyclical. Defense attorneys would later argue in court that this volatility had a neurological origin. That years of football concussions during high school and college, compounded by the physical and psychological strain of military service, had caused a form of traumatic brain injury that left Herbie unable to fully control his impulses or accurately perceive reality. They argued he was, in the language of the courtroom, at war with his own brain. Prosecutors had a different framework entirely. They called it a choice. And they had evidence to support that framing that no amount of brain imaging could explain away. That evidence was the hidden cameras. Investigators discovered that Herbie had installed surveillance equipment inside Toya's home to secretly record her teenage daughter. Think about what that reveals. A man who built his public reputation on caring for vulnerable children, students with disabilities, young people from difficult backgrounds, had secretly placed a camera in the private spaces of a teenage girl in his own household. The gentleness that his community celebrated was a performance. The darkness behind it was what was real. On the evening of August 7th, 2013, Herbie moved between 2 locations in the Dallas metropolitan area with weapons and an explosive device. He went first to a home in southwest Dallas on Long Canyon Trail, where Toya Smith lived with her daughter, Tasmia Allen, and other household members. He shot and killed Toya, 43 years old. He shot and killed Tasmia, who was 17. He shot and wounded 2 other young people in the home, Storm Malone, 14, and a 17-year-old named Dasmine Mitchell. One of the victims was reportedly on the phone with a relative when the shooting began. That relative's call for help eventually set the discovery of the scene in motion. Herbie did not stop. He drove approximately 10 miles south to DeSoto, Texas, to the home of his estranged wife Zena. He threw an explosive device, described variously as a grenade or a military-style device, into the living room before entering. The device detonated inside the home. He then entered and opened fire. Zena Bowser, 47 years old, was shot and killed. Her daughter Nima Williams, 28, was also shot and killed. But not before Nima managed to reach her phone. She called 911. She spoke to the dispatcher. She identified Herbie by name. She begged for help. Her voice on that recording was played for the jury at trial, and people who heard it described the experience as something they could not easily set aside. Nima's toddler son was found nearby, hidden under a pile of coats, small and terrified but physically unharmed. Zena's 2 sons, approximately 10 and 13 years old, were shot and wounded but survived. Herbie ran out of ammunition during the DeSoto attack. When police arrived at the scene, he did not flee. He did not surrender. He attempted to blend into the scene, to present himself as a victim among victims, standing at the location of the crime he had just committed, repeating his name, his military rank, and his serial number, as if operating within a combat framework that existed only in his own perception. Officers recognized him immediately. He was taken into custody. His 2017 trial in Dallas County moved through the guilt phase with grim efficiency. The jury heard the 911 recording. They heard about the hidden cameras. They heard forensic testimony about the 2 separate attack locations and the connections between the victims and Irby's personal life. The insanity defense, built on the foundation of traumatic brain injury from football and military service, was rejected. The jury found that the evidence of planning and specific targeting outweighed the neurological arguments the defense presented. They convicted him of capital murder on May 5, 2017. In the penalty phase, prosecutors sought death. After hours of deliberation spread across 2 days, the jury deadlocked, unable to reach the unanimous agreement Texas law required to impose a death sentence. Under state law, that deadlock produced an automatic sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Irby Lee Bowser received that sentence on May 12, 2017. He was 48 years old. He remains in a Texas prison today. The Manny ACs still perform at Dallas Mavericks games. The arena where Irby once danced moves forward. The families of Toya, Tasmia, Zena, and Nima carry the weight of August 7, 2013, in ways that no sentencing phase can adequately address. Nima's child grew up. Toya's son Storm survived his injuries. And the question that lingers over Irby's story, whether what he did was the product of a broken brain or a broken moral compass, or some painful combination of both, may never have an answer clean enough to satisfy anyone that was in those homes that night. Number 8. Paul Gilbert DeVoe III. Some men carry their violence like a private language, something they speak only in certain rooms, with certain people, in moments when they believe no one else is watching. For those around them, the warning signs are visible only in retrospect, once the worst has already happened, and the people doing the looking back are sitting in a hospital room or a courtroom, trying to make sense of how they missed it. For the women in Paul Gilbert DeVoe III's life, the warning signs were not subtle. They were constant, physical, and documented. And yet he destroyed 6 lives in 48 hours before anyone could stop him. Paul was born on August 31, 1963, on Long Island, New York. His parents divorced when he was 2 years old, and he grew up without knowing his biological father, eventually gaining a stepfather through his mother's remarriage. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade. Drinking began in his early teenage years and never stopped. It only accumulated company. By his 20s, Paul's relationship with alcohol had become the frame through which his violence expressed itself. He fired a shotgun at a group of teenagers during a drinking session. He attempted to strangle his own mother with a telephone cord, and she sought a protective order against him, her own son. Between 1980 and 2002, he accumulated multiple arrests and prison terms in New York. 5 DUI convictions, criminal trespass, aggravated harassment, petty theft. He had 4 children from different relationships, all of which collapsed under the weight of his physical abuse of the women involved. Methamphetamine joined the pattern by the time he moved to Texas in 2005. He settled in the Hill Country area. He began a relationship with a woman named Glenda Purcell. 6 months in, he assaulted her, breaking her nose, injuring her back, leaving visible bruising on her face. She obtained a protective order. Paul was formally made aware that she had done so. He was temporarily allowed to stay at the home of another woman, who asked him to help with construction work on her property. When she discovered he had a firearm on the premises, which she had explicitly prohibited, she told him to leave. That eviction, stacked on top of the protective order, stacked on top of a life that had been contracting for years, became the pressure that finally ignited something Paul could not contain. On August 24, 2007, he stole a pickup truck from the property. He armed himself. He began driving toward the places where the people he blamed for his condition could be found. That same evening, he entered O'Neill's Sports Tavern in Marble Falls, Texas. He located Glenda at the bar. He approached her from behind, placed his hand over her eyes, put the barrel of his .38 caliber Jennings semi-automatic pistol to her head, and pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. Glenda ran toward the men's restroom, screaming for help. The bartender on duty, Michael Allred, 41 years old, heard her voice. Michael stepped out from behind the bar and put himself between Glenda and Paul. He tried to speak calmly. He tried to take the weapon. Michael Allred, a man doing his job in a bar in Marble Falls, Texas, placed his body between a woman and the man trying to harm her. Paul fired once. The single shot severed Michael's aorta. He died at the scene. Glenda ran out through the back of the building and reached a police station on foot. Paul fled in the stolen truck. Witnesses watched him go. He drove to Jonestown, Texas, to the home of a former girlfriend, Paula Griffith, 46 years old. Inside that house that night were Paula's daughter, Haley Faulkner, 15, Paula's boyfriend, Jay Feltner, 48, and Haley's friend, Danielle Hensley, 17, who was spending the night before a trip the two teenagers had been planning together. Danielle and Haley had made plans. They were 17 and 15. They had things to look forward to. Paul entered the residence and shot all 4 people inside it. The autopsy reports described the wounds with clinical precision. Paula was shot in the back of the head, Haley in the right temple, Jay at close range. Danielle was struck 4 times, 3 of those shots to the head. None of them survived. Paul stole Paula's station wagon and drove east. The following day, August 25th, his vehicle began to fail somewhere near Greencastle, Pennsylvania. He stopped at the home of Betty Jane DeHart, 81 years old. He had no connection to Betty. He did not know her. He needed a car. He shot and killed her, took her Hyundai Elantra, and kept driving north toward Long Island. He was arrested 2 days later, on August 27th, in Shirley, Long Island, by the New York, New Jersey Regional Fugitive Task Force. He had a handgun and briefly threatened to harm himself before officers talked him into surrendering. He was extradited to Texas. A Travis County grand jury indicted him for the capital murders of Haley Faulkner and Danielle Hensley, the 2 teenagers who had been present in a house that Paul chose to visit for reasons that had nothing to do with either of them. In late 2008, a court ruled him mentally incompetent to stand trial and sent him to a psychiatric facility. By April of 2009, he was deemed competent. His trial began in September of that year. The jury deliberated for approximately 20 minutes. They convicted him of capital murder. On October 8, 2009, he was sentenced to death and transferred to death row at the Allen B. Polunsky unit. As of early 2026, Paul Gilbert DeVoe III remains on death row. His appeals have been denied at every level through the federal system. A motion for an execution date was filed in 2026. He is in his early 60s. Michael Allred tried to save someone and was shot for it. Betty Jane DeHart answered her door and did not survive the encounter. 2 teenage girls were making plans for a trip they would never take. Glenda Purcell, whose name started this entire sequence, survived. She ran out the back of a bar in Marble Falls and kept running. And somewhere on Long Island, in a county where Paul was born and raised, and where he ultimately tried to return, he was arrested in the end the same way it all began. In a place where he had already done irreparable damage and simply did not know how to stop. Pennsylvania declined to extradite him for Betty's murder after the Texas death sentence was secured. Her family chose not to pursue a separate trial. They found what closure they could in the conviction that already existed. That is often how these cases end. Not with total accounting, not with every victim formally acknowledged in a verdict, but with whatever fragment of justice the system can deliver before it simply runs out of road. Number 9. Charles Frederick Albright. There are cases that disturb us because of the sheer scale of the violence, and then there are cases that disturb us in a completely different way. Not because of scale, but because of precision, because of the strange, cold intelligence that seems to operate behind the act, because of the feeling, when you read the details carefully, that you are not looking at an eruption of uncontrolled rage, but at something far more deliberate and far more disturbing. Charles Frederick Albright belongs to that second category. The details of what he allegedly did in Dallas in the winter of 1990 and into the spring of 1991 still unsettle investigators and criminologists who study them today, not because of the volume of harm, but because of what the harm itself suggests about the person who inflicted it. Charles was born on August 10, 1933, in Amarillo, Texas, and was adopted shortly after birth by Fred and Dell Albright. His adoptive mother was a school teacher, strict, intensely focused on academic performance, and controlling in the specific way that some highly educated people are when they treat a child as a project rather than a person. She accelerated Charles's education to a degree that was unusual even by the standards of the time, allowing him to skip multiple grades. He graduated from high school at 15. He entered college early. By every educational measure available, he was gifted. He was also, from early adolescence, something far more complicated than simply gifted. By the time he was 13, he had been arrested for aggravated assault. By the time he was a young adult, he had developed a pattern of deception so ingrained it functioned like a second personality. He forged academic credentials to claim qualifications he had never earned. He was expelled from Arkansas State Teachers College for theft without prosecution. He held various jobs across different fields, consistently misrepresenting himself to obtain them. He served time for theft and forgery. In 1981, he pleaded guilty to a charge involving inappropriate conduct with a 9-year-old child, a crime for which he received probation, and later claimed he entered the plea simply to avoid the hassle of trial. His entire life was built on a foundation of misdirection, false identity, and a deeply practiced ability to present himself as something he was not. Underneath all of that, according to people who studied him after his arrest, ran a fixation that began in childhood and never resolved. As a boy, Charles had reportedly removed the glass eyes from his dolls. He had shown an interest in taxidermy, the practice of preserving and mounting animal bodies, that gave him early, hands-on familiarity with anatomy and the tools used to work with it. As an adult, he owned a copy of Gray's Anatomy. He possessed X-Acto knives. He had true crime books. He had the knowledge base and the manual dexterity of someone who had spent years developing both. He lived in Dallas in the late 1980s and early 1990s, supported largely by a girlfriend named Dixie, while supplementing his income with an early morning newspaper delivery route that took him through the southern neighborhoods of the city before most of its residents were awake. In December of 1990, the body of a woman named Mary Lou Pratt, 33 years old, was discovered in a field in southern Dallas. She was partially clothed. She had been shot in the back of the head with a .44 caliber round. And her eyes were gone, not damaged, not simply injured. They had been removed with a precision that the medical examiner described as surgical. Minimal damage to the surrounding eyelid tissue, clean extraction. A level of technical control that is not accidental and is not the product of panic. They had been taken. Investigators had nothing like this in their reference files. The eyes were never recovered. On February 10, 1991, a second woman was found in similar circumstances. Susan Peterson was 27 years old. She was found partially clothed near a road in the same general area of southern Dallas. She had been shot 3 times, in the head, the chest, and the back of the head. Her eyes had also been removed with the same remarkable precision. A clump of hair was found resting on her body. On March 18, 1991, a third woman was found near a school in southern Dallas. Shirley Williams was 41 years old. She had been shot. Her face showed evidence of additional trauma, bruising, a broken nose, injuries that indicated this encounter had involved more physical force than the previous 2. And her eyes were gone, removed with the same technique that had been applied to Mary Lou and Susan. All 3 women were sex workers who operated in the Oak Cliff and southern Dallas areas. All 3 had their eyes removed with what multiple forensic professionals described as a technique consistent with someone who possessed anatomical knowledge and steady hands. The killer had not rushed. He had not been careless. He had taken the time, with each woman, in each separate instance, to perform an extraction that required precision and calm. The question of what was done with those eyes was never answered. They were never found. The investigation that followed was one of the most carefully constructed in Dallas criminal history. Investigators spoke to sex workers who operated in the area. Multiple women identified Charles as a known customer. They recognized him by his vehicle. They recognized him by his description. Hair samples recovered from the victims and from his truck and vacuum cleaner were subjected to microscopic comparison and found to be consistent with his. Investigators searched his home and found the X-Acto knives, the anatomy texts, the true crime materials, and a yellow raincoat connected to one of the victims. He was arrested on March 22, 1991. His trial began in December of that year. On December 18th, 1991, he was convicted of the murder of Shirley Williams. The charges related to Mary Lou Pratt and Susan Peterson were dropped because the evidence, while compelling, was insufficient for a separate conviction beyond reasonable doubt in those individual cases. He received a life sentence. He maintained his innocence. Some of his supporters attempted to redirect suspicion toward a former tenant of his property, a man named Axton Schindler, who had been found with a box of .44 caliber ammunition. Investigators looked at Schindler carefully. They found no physical evidence linking him to any of the crime scenes. The sex workers who had identified Charles had not identified Schindler. Charles had the knowledge, Charles had the tools, and Charles, by every credible account, had the fixation. In prison, he decorated his cell with drawings of eyes. Visitors who came to see him described him as courteous, articulate, and entirely untroubling in person, which was, by that point in his story, precisely what you would expect from a man who had spent his entire life being something very different from what he appeared. Charles Frederick Albright died of natural causes on August 22, 2020, in Lubbock, Texas. He was 87 years old. He outlived the women he was convicted of targeting by nearly 3 decades. Mary Lou was 33, Susan was 27, Shirley was 41. Their eyes were taken and never returned. And the man who took at least one of them died quietly in a prison hospital bed, having never once provided an explanation that satisfied anyone. Number 10. Andrew Joseph Stack III. We tend to think of acts of political violence as something imported, something born in foreign capitals and carried across borders in the minds of people who hate what America represents from the outside. We are far less prepared, culturally or psychologically, for the version of extremism that is entirely homegrown, the kind that develops in a suburban home office, that builds slowly over decades in the gaps between tax filings and audit notices and perceived injustices that accumulate like sediment at the bottom of a life. Andrew Joseph Stack III is that version. And what makes his story so deeply unsettling is not that he was unusual. It is that he was, in almost every visible way, completely ordinary, right up until the morning he was not. Andrew, who went by Joe, was born on August 31st, 1956, in Pennsylvania. He was orphaned at age 4, reportedly after his parents died in an automobile accident, and spent time in a Catholic orphanage before he and a brother were eventually enrolled at the Milton Hershey School, a Pennsylvania boarding institution for orphaned boys in Hershey. He graduated in 1974. He studied engineering at Harrisburg Area Community College, beginning in 1975, but did not complete a degree. He later referenced those years in his manifesto: the institutional food, the discipline, the sense of being processed by a system that did not particularly care about the individuals moving through it. These experiences did not break him, but they did plant something, a seed of distrust toward large institutions, a suspicion, sharp and early, that the systems people depend on are designed to serve themselves rather than the people inside them. Most people who grow up in orphanages and boarding schools absorb that lesson and move forward. Andrew absorbed it and carried it like a compass, using it to interpret everything that came after. As an adult, he built a career as an embedded software consultant and engineer, the kind of highly technical work that requires precision, patience, and an ability to operate inside complex systems. He incorporated businesses, including Prowess Engineering, in 1985. He married, divorced, and married again. His first marriage ended with financial entanglements and tax liabilities that followed him for years. He obtained a private pilot's license in 1994 and owned aircraft. By the early 2010s, he was living in Austin, Texas, with his second wife Cheryl and their daughter. He was working as an independent software contractor, operating in that specific economic gray zone, where skilled professionals do high-level technical work for corporate clients without the protections of full employment. He was, to his neighbors and colleagues, and the people who passed him in the hallway of his office building, an unremarkable middle-aged professional. Competent, quiet, ordinary, but underneath that ordinary life, something had been compounding for a long time. Andrew believed, and he documented this belief in extraordinary detail, that the American tax system was an instrument of institutional cruelty designed to protect corporations and the politically connected while systematically crushing people like him. He was particularly consumed by Section 1706 of the 1986 Tax Reform Act, a provision that reclassified independent technical contractors in ways that made their financial situations more precarious and their tax obligations more complicated. He felt personally targeted by IRS audits. He felt that rules had been changed specifically to disadvantage people who worked the way he worked. He pointed to corporate bailouts, healthcare industry failures, and what he described as the fundamental corruption of a system that claimed to serve citizens while actually serving its own perpetuation. His manifesto, a document he had been writing and refining over time, laid all of this out with the methodical specificity of a man who had rehearsed the argument so many times it had become indistinguishable from his identity. The night before February 18th, 2010, Andrew and his wife Cheryl argued. The nature of the argument, the specifics, the final words, remain private. What we know is that Cheryl took their daughter and checked into a hotel that evening, leaving the house in the Schofield Farms neighborhood of North Austin empty, except for Andrew. He spent that night alone. He made his decisions alone. He composed or finalized the manifesto, signed it with his name and the bracketed years of his birth and death, a document that already acknowledged, in its own heading, that its author would not survive the day it was published. He posted it online early the following morning on his website, embeddedart.com. Then he set his house on fire. The fire at the Schofield Farms home was not an accident and was not impulsive. It was the first deliberate act of a sequence Andrew had planned. He watched what he needed to see, then drove approximately 20 miles north to Georgetown Municipal Airport. He climbed into his single-engine Piper Dakota, registration N2889D. He communicated with the control tower. He told them he was heading southbound. He was telling the truth about the direction and lying about everything else. At 9:56 in the morning, approximately 10 minutes after takeoff, Andrew flew that aircraft at full throttle directly into the second floor of Echelon Y, a 7-story office complex at 9420 Research Boulevard in Austin, Texas. The building housed offices for the Internal Revenue Service on its upper floors. The impact produced a fireball and an explosion that was felt and seen across a significant radius. First responders, including a hazmat training unit that happened to be nearby, moved toward the building immediately. Andrew Stack died in the impact. He was 53 years old. He died with his manifesto published online, and his house burning behind him, having scripted his own death as the punctuation mark of a grievance he had been composing for decades. Vernon Hunter was 68 years old. He was an IRS Revenue Officer Group Manager. He was a Vietnam veteran, originally from Orangeburg, South Carolina, a family man with a wife named Valerie and children who knew him as a father who was present and engaged and full of life. He was not a policy architect. He was not the person who wrote Section 1706. He was not the embodiment of the institutional cruelty that Andrew's manifesto raged against. He was a man at his desk on a Thursday morning, doing his job, a job that, by accounts from his colleagues, he performed with patience and a genuine effort to help taxpayers, including those in financial difficulty, find workable paths forward. Vernon Hunter was killed in the crash. 13 other people were injured, 2 of them severely. The building housed approximately 200 IRS employees in total. Nearly all of them went to work that morning, expecting an ordinary Thursday, and spent the rest of their lives carrying something they did not expect to carry. The FBI investigated quickly and efficiently. Andrew's identity was confirmed through the aircraft registration, the posted manifesto, the fire at his home, and records from the airport. The case was classified as a criminal assault on a federal officer rather than an act of international terrorism. Investigators confirmed he had acted entirely alone. No organization, no cell, no broader network. He was a lone actor, fueled entirely by the particular chemistry of financial grievance, personal loss, and decades of accumulated conviction that the system had destroyed him specifically. In the aftermath, some voices, including Andrew's daughter Samantha Bell, briefly, before she retracted her words, described him as someone who had been pushed beyond endurance by a system that refused to acknowledge his existence. She later clarified that she mourned the man but not the act. She mourned a father while recognizing what that father had taken from another family. The IRS spent over $32 million on enhanced security in the years following the attack. The Echelon building was repaired and reopened in 2011. Vernon Hunter's widow, Valerie, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Andrew's estate. His son Ken spoke publicly about a grief that did not follow a clean narrative because the man who caused it had attached that grief to a political statement about taxes, as if the death of a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran could be made coherent by an argument about independent contractor law. Andrew Joseph Stack III died certain that history would ultimately justify him. He left a manifesto full of anger and a burning house and a hole in the side of a federal building. Vernon Hunter was buried in South Carolina, surrounded by people who remembered him as full of life and unfailingly decent. The story is not about tax policy. It is not about government overreach. It is about a man who decided that his personal accounting of grievance was more important than the life of a grandfather at his desk. And it is about that grandfather, the one America barely remembers, whose name belongs at the center of this story, and who deserved to grow older in a world that Andrew Stack decided to exit by taking someone else with him.